question in the Q&A that somebody just posted. Can you give us the buyer template included besides the RPA? That actually is a class that we're going to be doing in March. That form is being updated. So because there's kind of a bit of an overhaul onto that form, I'll touch on it and how to use it as it relates to the RPA. But the form itself, we will be going over kind of in detail. That's a whole different ball of wax. And that we will be going over in a subsequent class. I believe it's in March. Shirley, you can give us a date if you recall which actual date that is. And yes, the record
March the 13th.
The 13th. Okay, perfect. And then yes, the recording will be available, I believe, also in March.
Correct.
And will the presentation be shared via email? If you mean slides, I don't know. I don't know if I have that available. I have it in I may be able to do that. I will see if I can. I will at the least give the pertinent page information on the form itself. Okay, so I'm not sure how many people we have signed up, but we have 40 in, so we're going to start now. And if you have any questions, again, please put them in the chat and we will proceed from there. And there we go. Okay. So we are going to start on page 1, oddly enough. It's kind of interesting when this changed, and it's been changed for 2 years. But when this changed 2 years ago, the majority of the pages that you are going to have to fill in are the first 3 pages. The center section, while it doesn't have any information that you're going to be filling out, you still need to pay attention to it. But this is the portion that is going to have the information that is changeable. The very first thing we're going to talk about is this right here, which is date prepared. Date prepared is the item that you're going to refer back to whenever you refer to this contract. It's not the date that it was signed. It's not the date that it was agreed. It's the date that it was prepared. Whenever you talk about a form, you're going to use that date prepared as the date that you refer to in that contract, addendum, amendment, whatever it is. This is the date that you refer to. Obviously, a date, this is an offer from, and the property to be acquired. Those are all sort of self-explanatory. Now, when we get down to the information on the seller's brokerage firm, the seller's agent, the buyer's brokerage firm, and the buyer's agent, that information needs to be filled out. A lot of agents will not fill out the license number or maybe not the name of the seller's agent. That needs to be filled out. Unless it is filled out, it is not a complete form. Make sure that you fill that out. It's not exceedingly difficult, but it does take a little bit of clicking around to find the correct license number. Do try to make sure you do that. Otherwise, you'll have to have an additional form to clarify. And this just makes it a cleaner acceptance if that's what your aim is. Purchase price, obviously, is that first line. And if it's all cash, you're going to have to check this box here over on the right. Close of escrow date, again, self-explanatory. Generally speaking, we're going to have dates after acceptance. There is the occasional time frame where somebody has a very specific date that they want to close by, and that's where you would put that. Don't just assume that you're going to have acceptance on a certain date and it's going to work out timeline. If you've got somebody that wants a specific date, make sure you put that date in there. The expiration of the offer is 3 calendar days after buyer's signature, or a certain amount of time you can put in there a different, it's either 5 p.m. or you can put it in a different time, but it's always 3 calendar days after acceptance. The initial deposit amount. Now, this is an interesting thing because most people don't realize that this purchase percentage, we're all used to having it be 3%. That percentage, whatever you put in that initial offer, does not change with subsequent changes in price. So if you want somebody to have a very specific amount down, you want to stick to that 3%, for example, that does need to change in subsequent counteroffers. In the initial, the increased deposit or the loan amounts, that type of thing, those are going to change based on the purchase price. This initial deposit will not. Excuse me. The increased deposit, if you want that to count towards the initial deposit, so that 3% is what you're aiming for. If you're going to have, for example, a 1% deposit and then 2% once conditions are approved, which is a pretty standard how most people write that. You are going to have to make sure that you fill out the DID form. If you do not fill out that DID form, that second deposit will not count towards that 3%, which most people look at as liquidated damages. So again, if that is your aim, you want to make sure that you're following the steps here that will increase that deposit and make sure it counts towards that additional percentage. The loan amount, now this is the one that's going to stay the same. So if you have, for example, the percentage of the purchase price, you're going to put down, I don't know, 80%, or you're going to get an 80% loan, you're going to put down 20%. This will stay the same. So the increased deposit will count towards the initial deposit. That loan amount will stay the same. So if you're going to get an 80% loan and you put that in there and you start at 950 and you end up at $1 million, that 80% is going to stay constant. Additional financing terms. This is not as common. The additional finance amount, there's second seller carryback. There's a lot of secondary financing that has not been at all common right now in the market that we're in. Most sellers are not too amenable to that unless you've got, you know, a crazy listing in the middle of the desert. You know, there's just nobody they're not 42 people lined up to buy it. It's just not as common. If that is, though, there is a seller financing form or other form in here that you can check that will add on automatically to that. This is a new type of automatic fill, which is basically the occupancy type. It's considered primary, or if it's not primary, then you would check secondary investment. So if you've got a vacation home or if it's an investment home, that's where you would check that. That would then trigger yet another addition. So your balance of down payment. So when you get to the close of escrow, how much additional money are they going to put down? And then your total purchase price will be shown there at the bottom. Those are automatic fills. That is not something you're going to need to fill out. Once you fill out the amount up here, this will add up those two or the rest of these boxes to make sure that that number adds. Okay, so when we get to this section here, you want to make sure that when you're filling out these forms, you look at this. I'm going to go back up here just because it's easier to read. This second paragraph box here. So we're working on section 3A, 3B, 3C. But this will reference in the bulk of the contract itself what section of the contract itself is referenced. So you want to make sure that you're reading these sections as well. So on this format here, these are the 3 sections that you will be filling out that have anything to do that can be changed in the contract. So in the contract itself, there is a text overflow addendum. So if you have, for example, a section of the contract where you're trying to fill out something like the expiration of the contract is 3 days on such and such a date. Actually, it's not a really good example. I'll use additional financing amount or anything in here that requires additional finance terms, for example, and something doesn't fit in this full section, it will automatically create a text overflow addendum. This is not a form that you can fill out independently of any section of the contract that you are trying to fill out. So for example, you have something that you know you're going to fill out, you know, that has 6 paragraphs to it. This is not something that you can take a TOA and then just add it yourself. You will fill out the section where that goes, and it will automatically create a text overflow addendum. So on this section, it talks about the deposit or the increased deposit. As I mentioned, that's one of the most common ones. The increased deposit made upon a removal of both investigation of property contingency and loan contingency. That's not going to fit in the contract box itself. It will automatically create the text overflow addendum. And in the RPA paragraph 7D9, a termite inspection prepared by the Neil D. Killen, incredibly awesome and always accurate pest control company. I love that Neil filled that out. That will fill out again in that section. So a lot of times you'll see somebody try and shrink up their words to fit in that little tiny section. Don't worry about it. Your text overflow is going to automatically reference which part of the contract it is attached to and also create that form for you. So it's not something that you need to write, termite insp by X company. You can just write it out and it will automatically attach for you. On this section here, it will say, as I mentioned on that text overflow addendum, CAR form, paragraph 2, that's what it's referring to. When you're talking about the termite, that's where it says paragraph 7D9. This is 7D9. It will automatically do the TOA text overflow addendum. So the purchase price used to be at the very top of the RPA. It's moved. I think it's self-explanatory, but it's clarified in here that it's moved further down. And they've given us a longer line for the APN because sometimes there are more than one. So you can actually have more than one APN on a purchase agreement. A lot of times people will do, for example, a lot split and include 2 APNs when they sell it later. The purchase price and the close of escrow are no negotiable terms. They belong in that grid. There's room for, as I mentioned, multiple APNs. The SB9 isn't really as common as I think they thought it would be when they passed it, but there are still people who have lot splits or property that they bought as 2 lots and able to fit their house on it. And then when they go to sell it, it includes 2 of those. The agreement means this document and any counteroffers and any incorporated addenda and amendments. Now, this is the thing that most people, not most, it's one of the more common errors that agents make. They get agreement on a counteroffer term, they sign the counteroffer, they send it, they get that signed, and then they think they have a deal. Then they're shocked when the seller accepts another deal in the meantime. Until and unless you have all of that paperwork back and signed and agreed and receipted on both sides, you do not have a transaction. So make sure that when you are sending something in for acceptance and signature, that you have all of the forms in and signed. Anything that's referenced in that contract. So when we get to the boxes that say additional terms that are added, such as a lot of agents or a lot of companies have terms that they add for their companies, like their disclosure amount, that all that kind of stuff. If that's written into the contract, it needs to be back and signed before you technically have a complete signed contract. And the other thing that's, I think, a mistake that a lot of agents make, parties acknowledge receipt of and that they have read and understand every page and all attachments that make up the agreement. If you aren't going through this contract line by line with your clients, and a lot of times agents will go through this first, then go through the terms and fill out the form and send it back for signatures. But unless you're going through that entire contract and they understand what it is and those paragraphs that are referenced in that grid, you could have a problem after the fact. So a lot of the problems that we have, and I've done hearings and mediations for around 20 years. A lot of those problems are, my agent didn't tell me, my agent didn't explain, I didn't know what I was signing. So again, make sure you go through this contract and explain to them what those paragraphs mean. So paragraph 3 is the terms of the purchase and the allocation of costs. We've gone through a little bit of this. The purchase price, again, which is either a loan or all cash. the close of escrow, and the expiration of the offer. So you want to make sure that the form of payment, the down payment, and all of that information is clearly understood by both your buyer and your seller, and that the timeline on this expiration of offer, a lot of agents will, I'm going to say, fudge that expiration of offer, and 3 calendar days doesn't necessarily mean 3 calendar days, that they'll come back after 5. You can do that, but you want to make it clear that you are basically revitalizing that offer at that point, because technically it isn't a live offer. You also want to make sure that that disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships is clearly identified, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that all of the information is in there. That is a requirement before the contract is signed. So unless that is filled out properly, again, it's not a huge issue, but it is incorrectly filled out. You don't technically have a completed form. Yeah, the buyer's broker. So this is an older form. Yes, this will be the year of the buyer brokerage, and it's not called BB anymore. It's called buyer representation agreement. But I love this. Blue Bloods, Breaking Bad, Big Ben, and this one. I looked at that for a minute and I'm like, oh, bad breath. So agency disclosure is a requirement. Again, if that form is not correctly filled out, that hasn't a lot, but I've seen it, negated a contract. So the buyer representation agreement, unless the property is 5 or more residential dwelling units, the buyer acknowledges receipt of the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. It's required on everything except, as it mentions, 5 or more dwelling units. So you want to make sure that if you have, and this is becoming more and more common. So there are room for 2 agents on the contract, but if you have, for example, a team and you have more than 1 agent in your office that you're working with, you want to make sure you have both of them in there and signed. If you have more than 1 office, you also can have a additional broker acknowledgement, which is called the ABA form. Do all the disclosures have to be included and signed before it is a complete contract when presenting the offer? Not the disclosures. The contract has to be agreed and signed before you have before you have an agreed upon contract. The disclosures are required in the course of the escrow, but the disclosures are secondary after the agreement on the contract itself. And would a video summary of the contract qualify as reviewing with the client? Giovanni Ruiz, good question. Yes, it can. As long as it's clear. It can be difficult to say that if you just sent them a video of you talking about the contract, whether or not they actually paid attention to it and or listened to it. I would prefer personally to send them first a contract, go over it with them, have them initial it and send it back, and have a conversation, generally via email, something that's like, hey, Fred, tomorrow at 5, I'm going to go over the contract with you. Please make sure you have an hour or 2 that we can discuss this. And then afterwards say, thanks for, chatting with me. And, I'm glad that we've gone over the contract and we're clear. Something along those lines. I always call them chatty Cathy emails, so that you have a record of having that discussion with them. If you send them a video and you don't actually interact with your client, they can always claim that they did not watch the video, or that they just didn't understand anything that you said. The agency disclosures can be signed at the same time as the contract. That's correct. You want it signed first, however, and make sure, again, that's why it's first in the listing. That's how it pops up, and that's how you would want to make sure it gets signed. Okay. So when you have more than 1 broker or agent, so the buyer and seller's agent is the same, you would check that box. If you have more than 1, you would check this box, and it'll send you to an additional form. So the additional broker acknowledgement is here. And this clarifies that the co-listing brokers are who they are, and they are representing either the seller or the landlord or the buyer and the tenant. So this is that form. It clarifies who they're representing, and you want to make sure that this is understood at the outset of that contract and that negotiation. And this is a amendment to or supersedes the agency confirmation. This is when there is either an error, the incorrect number was utilized. As I mentioned, if you don't do it properly, you'll have to change it. And then there's a second form. This is that second form. This is or is not. If it's not, the reason you would check the is not is if, for example, you have 3 agents and you only have room for 2 on the contract. This would allow you to add that additional agent. If it is an amendment, you're changing in midstream, or if you're adding, if there's another broker that you did not have room for, you would add it here. Unable to locate a BRE in zip forms, confirming we are now BRBC. The buyer representation, yes, that's correct. That's a buyer representation form. And again, that is going to change. I just got back literally Friday from CAR. That form is completely redlined and will be changed in the next upload of agency form changes. Okay, so I believe it's 3 times, perhaps 4 times in the contract. This is stated. This form is 16 pages. The parties are advised to read all 16 pages. So again, it mentions it several times in the contract. And again, one of the things that many of the lawsuits, and I know you guys have all heard about all of the lawsuits that are coming down from the NAR issues. One of the main themes of those lawsuits is that the buyers and or sellers did not understand the contract, did not understand what was happening, did not understand what they were signing. This is something, again, that we mention several times within the contract. California has always been pretty good about this. For your protection and for your clients' understanding, make sure you go through this with them. Again, you can have that initial conversation before you go show properties. That way you have that understanding so that when you fill out the forms, and sometimes you filled out 5, 6, 10 or more offers on properties, you're not going to want to go over every single deal, every single line 16 times. But if you do it one time and you have a record of that in writing, that you've gone through this with them, and then you reiterate anything that's an important clause. For example, if something's different from one transaction to another, just do it in writing. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. If it is in writing and they come back at you and you can say, no, look, here Fred, we went over this on July 12th and we discussed it. That will give you some level of protection. Terms of purchase and allocation of cost. Again, we're back at the purchase price. Is it an all cash offer? If it is an all cash offer, then there is not a loan contingency. I think that's self-explanatory, but we have had this question asked many times because it is an all cash offer, it does not preclude them from getting a loan. They can, in the middle of the transaction, decide that they really, really want to pay 6% for or 7% for a loan. And then they will go out and get a loan. They can do that as long as it doesn't change any of the terms of that contract. If they're still going to be able to close on the same date and it's not going to cause any issues with, for example, if it doesn't appraise. So they cannot use any of the other traditional outs for a loan because they have agreed to an all cash offer. You see a lot of times people will do that. They'll write an all cash offer and then go get a loan, and it annoys sellers sometimes because, I thought I was getting all cash offer. Well, technically the terms are the same. It isn't going to be closing any later. It isn't going to, have an issue with whether or not it appraises. However, they are still required to cooperate with letting the appraiser in, That goes into that 17 days where they have the right to investigate the property. That's all part of that timeline. And they can't unreasonably withhold agreement or cooperation with those terms. However, the buyer can't say, okay, now we need an extra week because we have a loan. They've agreed to close on a certain date. And presumably you have made sure, and the seller has made sure that that disclosure of their cash when they wrote the all cash offer was sufficient to purchase the property. So the initial deposit is whatever percentage of the purchase price, and the increased deposit will show as a percentage of the purchase price. Again, those two do not change so if you're putting $1,000 down and, you're buying the property for, 950,000, and then you end up with a purchase price of $1.2 million, that $1,000 doesn't change. Presumably somebody wouldn't put $1,000 in, but it's just for explanation purposes. So if you want that price to be increased, you would need to counter that as a seller's agent to make sure that that number is the number that they want. Or you can write in at some point whatever that amount is that you want them to increase that deposit to. The increased deposit are unchanged from the initial deposit, are unchanged from the original offer. What does change is this secondary increased deposit. So if you have a certain amount from the very beginning, and then you're going to increase to make it a 3% deposit, that's what you're going to make sure you form that DID. Initial deposit is different from EMD. Yes, that's correct. Initial deposit is the amount that they put in to essentially open escrow. Earnest money deposit is an amount that is it's a bank term essentially, and that is the full amount that they're going to put down against the loan. So 80-20 loan, for example, that 20% will stay the same. This deposit amount, however, does not change percentage-wise with the difference in the purchase price. So you want to make sure that if that's important to your client, that you are the one that counters that to make sure that that increase is included. And that's why this increased deposit, you would need to use that form DID at the time the deposit is made. So this is what that form is, and that form will allow that second deposit, that increased deposit, to be included in that initial deposit amount, or included in the 3%, or what we refer to as liquidated damages. If this form is not used, that second deposit, that increased deposit, is not included in that quote unquote liquidated damages amount. So again, if that's important to your client and you want to make sure that that second amount is included in that increased deposit, then you would want to make sure that you utilize this form. So if you have an FHA or VA loan, though you have some separate rules that go along with those loans. They're different than a conventional loan in the requirements, both on the buyer and the seller. So the buyer is more protected with an FHA and VA loan. They are, if you remove the appraisal contingency, even if your buyer said, it's okay, I'm happy with just removing all of the contingencies, and I'm going to buy the house no matter what, they actually can't, by law, remove that appraisal cancellation right there with the FHA or VA loan. So even if they said it's fine and I'm going to remove it, they still have that legal right based on that loan to not purchase the property if the appraisal doesn't come in. It doesn't preclude them from, if they've decided they still want to purchase the house, making that difference in payment to match that appraisal. They can still do that, but they aren't required to close if that appraisal doesn't come in. So just remember that it's a right that they have, but it's also something that you want to keep in mind if, again, that's important to your seller. And that's basically the appraisal contingency is limited to the value determined by the appraisal. So again, that cancellation right stays in place for the FHA VA, a mandatory clause. It's clarified here in this form as well. And if you have an FHA VA loan, another reason that you want to make sure that you read through the contract and go over this with your client is because it is clarified within this form what those rights are. And if, again, it says, after signing this amendatory clause, the price increases, the buyer and seller agree to sign before the close of escrow a new amendatory clause that reflects the final purchase price agreed to the buyer and the seller. So again, those numbers still have to line up, regardless of what you've agreed to. If they've said we'll make up the difference or whatever, they still have the legal right to change that as well. So when you get to the request for repair, and this is kind of an interesting section here, a lot of times people feel like they're the request for repair is a requirement for the seller to do some of those repairs. They actually don't even have to answer. If you make a request for repair, the seller doesn't have to answer it at all. However, if you have a VA or FHA buyer, there are some required repairs if the buyer is going to continue. Doesn't mean the seller has to agree. It just means if they're going to continue, the buyer cannot pay for those repairs. It's not, a lot of agents mistake the requirement for those fees to be paid by the seller as a requirement for them to do it regardless of their choice. And that's not that's not what is actually here. It's only if they decide to continue. Similar to a request for repair, similar to any request. Like if you have a buyer that wants you to pay closing costs, you don't have to. You do if you want to continue, but you don't have to by law. For example, if you've agreed to that contract, you don't have to agree to everything that buyer wants. You don't have to agree to put on a new roof. If you don't agree, the likelihood is that buyer will cancel, but that doesn't mean you have to, regardless of what your wants are. So remember, when there's a request for repair, even with an FHA or VA request for repair, even though it's required by the loan, it's not required for the seller to do. So if the seller is willing to walk away from that transaction, they don't want to do those repairs, they can. Again, you have to have a home inspection. These forms are automatic. They fill in when you sign this agreement with your contract. I mean, with your when you sign the contract with your buyer or seller. This is a part that's a huge mistake that a lot of agents make, not filling out this section of the loan. So when you have a fixed rate not to, or an additional adjustable rate, not to exceed, and they leave this blank. And they pay 0 points and they leave this blank. So what you're doing is essentially you're saying, I agree, or my buyer agrees to take whatever loan is available at the time. If you don't fill out that amount, then there is nothing to utilize for your buyer to change his mind about accepting this contract. So if you say, I'm going to get a loan for, 80% of the purchase price, and you don't put in a rate and rates go up, you don't have the right to back out based on the rates going up. If your buyer only wants to pay 5.5% and rates go up to 6.5% and you haven't filled in this amount, he has to pay 6.5% per the contract. And again, he can say no, but his deposit could be at risk. If this section is not filled out, you could be putting your buyer's deposit at risk if they cancel based on the loan. And this is a very often missed section that needs to be clarified. And again, this occupancy type is automatically primary. If it's going to be a secondary home or an investment home, make sure you check that form as well. And the percentage and all that also goes for the additional financed amount. So if you have, for example, I love these rates, 3. I don't know how long ago that was, but it was lovely when it lasted. And it goes up to a higher percentage amount. then that number could massively increase the amount that they would have a monthly payment, and your buyer is not going to be happy with you if they lose either their deposit or the house or both, because they didn't write in there that there was a loan amount that they did not want to pay above. So the loan amounts and the down payments will be adjusted in the same proportion as the original offer, but the initial increased deposit amounts shall remain unchanged. I've gone over that a couple of times, and that's exactly what that refers to, is that section has to be clarified to make sure that you understand how much money they're putting down and then what the percentage is for their loan as well. If the buyer puts 20% down, then are we putting the initial deposit for liquidated damages will be under the second one. I'm not sure what that question means. If you put 20% down on a purchase, liquidated damages, which is shorthand for that initial deposit. So liquidated damages is actually a legal concept. We just use it as shorthand. That initial deposit is limited if you agree with your signatures on the liquidated damages clause, which we'll get to later in the contract. That is limited to 3% of the purchase price or the actual deposit. So it's limited to the actual deposit or 3%, whichever is less. So if it's 20% in that initial deposit, then that would not be liquidated damages. If you want to increase the deposit, that second section would require you to use a form that would make sure that would clarify as the additional deposit for liquidated damages. And that would be the initial deposit amount here. So the initial deposit amount is generally that, $5,000 you put into open escrow. Increased deposit, generally speaking, people are going to increase this. Most of us use the rule of thumb of 3%. We'll put in that additional deposit once conditions are met and they've removed contingencies. And that's an automatic, by the way, upon removal of contingencies, or you can have a date specific. That will be that second amount that needs to have the DID form. So that loan amount, this is where you would put down how much you're going to get an 80% loan or whatever. The additional deposit, the balance of down payment here would make up that 20%. So the initial deposit plus the second deposit, if that doesn't equal whatever your percentage is that you're going to put down for your loan, that's where that would show, is down here is the balance of down payment. Earnest money deposit is really not a term that we utilize any longer. They call it initial deposit. You can call it an earnest money deposit. Again, we all use a different shorthand for what these numbers are, but the initial deposit amount is the one that we generally use to open escrow. It's the percentage of a purchase price that will show in here. The increased deposit, this is the one that we all kind of look at as that we want to equal 3%. That is just been a rule of thumb in the industry. It really isn't based on anything other than, what we feel is a safe amount. But again, you really would have to get into a lot of some legal definitions of what damages are. And when people want to keep other people's deposit, we tend to we can't give legal advice. So really we would have them talk to an attorney at that point anyway. So I think we just want to make sure that this is as tight as possible and as clean as possible. And those are the numbers we work with to kind of make it work within the rules as they sit. Okay, so page 2 goes into, and I'll start here, the seller credit to buyer. So this is kind of an interesting term, and I think it's going to be used more and more as the market changes. Right now, the idea of a seller credit to the buyer has most sellers laughing. We've had so many transactions starting from COVID until this point where sellers basically have asked for everything but their firstborn child. in order to get that deal done. But you know, markets are nothing if not malleable, and we're going to change, and it's going to go into a different form. So just understand that this is a market now where the sellers are more in control. We're going to eventually end up in a market where they're not, and there are more buyers. So this is where we have that percentage of a purchase price. Sometimes the seller is going to give a credit maybe for flooring. Maybe they're going to give, you know, they know their roof needs to be replaced, whatever that is. They either will reduce the price by that or they will give a credit for that. That's where you would put that. And again, you want to make sure if there is a credit to the buyer, that is cleared through the lender if they are getting a loan, because lenders will often have a limit of an amount that you can give. And again, this will connect with this section, which is the verification. If you've got an all cash offer, verification of down payment and closing costs. Again, those numbers that I mentioned above, the initial deposit, the increased deposit, and then at the very bottom, the amount that they're going to put down for their loan. So you want to make sure that all of those numbers are clarified. They either have a pre-qualification, pre-approval, or a fully written pre-approval. So this is an area where a lot of buyers have, and I've seen more and more of these recently, the fully written pre-approval. It's an area where buyers can have a little bit of an advantage rather than going in with a pre-qualification, which is essentially a letter that says, yeah, this person, I talked to him. Pre-approval is based on what they've told me. If it's true, they can qualify. The fully written underwritten pre-approval is, I've looked at their numbers, I've looked at their bank accounts, and yeah, this guy has the ability to get this loan. This is a much stronger offer. We're seeing a lot more of those, given the requirements of a lot of sellers now. And I'm not sure I agree with this, that they can potentially allow a loan buyer to compete with an all cash buyer. Yes and no. What this has with it that an all cash buyer doesn't is the appraisal. And sometimes that can be a sticking point. You can have, there are some loans out there that will waive the appraisal depending on the amount that they're pre-approved for. So technically this can be true, but again, that appraisal can be a sticking point. So just be aware that it does give you a much stronger position as well. Oh, and I love this. And the reasoning behind this, paragraph 3I and 3O. And the reason that they left them blank intentionally, and they're just a big line that says intentionally left blank, is because 3I can be 31 and 3O can look like 30. So they just left them blank so that there was not confusion, because we all have too much confusion. I love that. The final verification of condition. How does the seller know for sure if it was a fully underwritten approval if the buyer's agent lied? Because presumably you would have a letter from the lender, and one of the terms of the approval of the underwriting letter from the lender is that you can talk to them. And so either the agent or the seller should be talking to that lender and finding out. They don't have the right to tell you all about all their financial stuff, but you do have the right to ask if they have fully written under approval, and you do have the right to ask about their ability to qualify for that loan that they're offering on your property. So yeah, I would have them speak to that lender. When you get that fully written underwritten approval, talk to that lender and make sure that that is actually as they have stated. The verification of property conditions. So this is an interesting section that people also very often get incorrect. Buyers don't understand, and buyers agents don't understand how this actually works. And in the last, so 2 years ago, when this, when the RPA was redone, they switched the, this section used to be second after the walkthrough section, which is kind of interesting. So the buyer final inspection, and this is that form. This form is not a contingency of the agreement. So the verification of property or its waiver isn't intended to alter the contractual obligations, right? But the buyer acknowledges that the property is in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance. So when we say that a property is as is, and a lot of agents will write as is into the contract, this is what we're referring to. So that the property is in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the offer to purchase. That's literally what that says. And so a lot of times people will rewrite that property as is. This is a more fleshed out version of that. You literally do not need to write it again in the contract. This is what that says, that property isn't changed. It doesn't have a giant hole in the wall now or the roof or anything else. It's still the same as is. And people think if they write as is that the buyers don't have a right to ask for repairs. That's not true. They always have a right to ask for repairs. Always. The seller can always say no. In fact, it even says in the contract that seller doesn't even have to answer. So this is a clarification of what that means, that the property is substantially in the same condition as on the date of acceptance. That means it was sold as is. If the buyer, for some reason, doesn't care about the condition of the property, and we did see some of that when people were so frantic to get a property, the buyer waives the right to conduct a final verification. And I love this. Buyer is acting against the advice of the broker. Yeah, you should probably walk through the property. On the contract itself, we have in the timeline the assignment request. This is another one that agents get incorrect a lot of the time. So currently the assignment request is 17 days as a base. Okay, so this is if XYZ buyer decides that he wants to add his brother, sister, cousin, uncle, mom, whoever, somebody else on title with him because they can't qualify for the loan. So he wants to add somebody else onto the purchase. This is an assignment. Adding somebody is a partial assignment. If you have, XYZ LLC and they want to no longer, they're going to have their buddy who has QML LLC take over the purchase, that is a full assignment. So the assignment request is not one that is, it annoys sellers, but it is not one they can just exclude out of hand. They have to have a reasonable agreement to do that assignment. So if you have, we want to add the brother so that we can get the loan, they have to agree to work with them. And if they want to give it to, XYZ company, they do have the right for that XYZ company to also provide financial information, but they can't unreasonably withhold agreement. They have the right to approve of them, but they can't, if they're somebody that has no credit and all that, then yeah, they can say, I don't approve of the credit, but they can't say you can't change. So again, that's one that is, it's a stickier situation. Not a lot of it happens, but when it does, people seem to think that they have the right to say no, and they don't. No, this isn't something new. We actually have always had the right to do an assignment. It just doesn't have the right, much like when you say that you're going to buy it for all cash and then you get a loan. You don't have the right to change any of the terms, but you do have the right to make that change in the purchaser or the assignment of that property. The appraisal contingency, when we get into this, is a minimum of the purchase price. Is another one where a lot of people have a real kind of a misunderstanding of what this is. So the appraisal contingency is based upon appraised value at a minimum of the purchase price or X amount. So if you have this property that's available, that you've written the offer for $950, and you say, okay, if it doesn't appraise, I'm happy to come up with $10,000 to meet the gap of that purchase price. You would write in here, the offer price is $950. You're going to write $940 in here. So the appraisal contingency is a minimum of the purchase price or $940. So if it is $940, you're going to pay that $10,000. The price is still $950, but you're going to pay that $10,000 gap. That gap amount is going to stay the same no matter what the purchase price is. So if you go up to $1.2 million, the gap is still going to be $10,000. Loan contingencies. This is just shows that the loan contingency removal has to be accompanied with the CR form. And this would be loan. Then you can do loan and appraisal. Each one separately, or you can do all as well. The contingency removal does not mean they can't come back on the property. This is another error that agents make all of the time. They've removed all their contingencies. They don't have a right to come back on the property. Yes, they do. They can actually come back for 17 days or whatever this number has been filled out as. And that's usually, they have a decorator, they want to measure for curtains, they want to see what the appliances are, that kind of stuff. That does not mean that they get to then create another contingency or create a problem or anything like that. They have the right for access to the property for informational purposes. But again, they cannot withhold that just because they've removed their other contingencies. Now, these contingencies from 4, 5, 6, 7, all of them say they're all 17 days or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. So if, for example, the seller doesn't give his TDS SPQ or title report, the HOA docs, or information on their solar until 14 days after acceptance, the buyer has 5 days from that date to review that information. So that would give them 19 days. So as a seller, you want to make sure that you deliver all of that information as quickly as possible so that you have this timeline to stick to. If you come to the end of that timeline and you're within the 17 days of their acceptance, you're like, oh, I'm going to give it to them on the 17th day, they have to remove it. No, they have 5 days from receipt, whenever that is. And so you don't want to give your buyers, if you're the seller's agent, you don't want to give those buyers additional time and be out of this time frame. Because if you've got a seller who wants to stick to that timeline and they have a very specific closing of escrow date or anything like that, you don't want to have that be extended because you didn't deliver the documents in time. The sale of seller's property is also a contingency. If you have the sale of a seller's property added onto this agreement, you want to make sure that you have the COP filled out properly. The sale of and closing escrow on that buyer's property, you want to make sure you check which one. So you either have what for only entering into a contract or the close of escrow on that contract. Most people are going to put close of escrow because we've all seen transactions get a little hinky here, 3/4 of the way through sometimes. So you don't want to have homeless sellers. They would not be happy with you. Again, that's kind of a function of the market that we're in. It's not been as problematic in the past, but now because it's so difficult to find properties, replacement properties, at least in state, out of state, not as much, but certainly something that you want to make sure that your sellers have nailed down. And then you also can have this sale, not nearly as common because it's difficult enough to be a buyer right now, but there's also the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. So this clarifies the time to give notice to remove contingencies and whether or not they have a delayed right to notify the buyer if they have a backup offer, or no right to notify buyer until the entire term of the agreement. I've seen this a lot, the no right to notify buyer. I've seen a lot of pushback to give them that 17 days, but after that, if you get a backup offer, that they have the right to then ask this buyer to perform. And they have to either show that they can buy it without the sale of their house, or they have to basically cancel. However, if you do invoke this right, then you give them back their deposit and any expenses that they may have had at that point to move to backup buyers. So you want to make sure that your sellers understand that it isn't that we get to keep their money and get the second buyer. No, you just get to let them out of the deal. So the contingency, this clarifies what that is when they're going to say that they're going to buy it, is that the seller gives notice to buyer to remove the contingencies and take the actions in paragraph 7B, which is basically to purchase the property without proof. He has to give the right to remove the contingency, remove the loan contingency, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close the escrow without the sale of the buyer's property. Most buyers can't do that. If they can't do that, you cancel, you give them their money back, and you move on to the second buyer. This is a new change as well. And this, I don't think it's as common now, but in the very beginning, it caught a lot of people kind of flat-footed. So the time of possession shows that upon notice of recordation. If you don't put a time specific in here, it's whenever that happens. That can be 8 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night. And if you want somebody who wants a time certain, you're going to want to put that in there. Otherwise, you're kind of at the mercy of whenever that happens. And we know lately that that's been a little bit hinky. Sometimes that has changed, and sometimes it's been real problematic. So if you have a very specific timeline, you've got moving vans, waiting, etc., you want to definitely specify a time. Does that mean that the seller must refund inspection expenses? Yes, actually it does. It has in here. The buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow. Oh, sorry. This is on the contingency of buyer's property. I only have a part of the contract. I'll find it and get it to you as well. But yes, reasonable expenses are if they have paid for an appraisal, for example, that can be refunded. If it's being canceled because of a backup buyer and their position has been removed, yes, you do have to give them back expenses that they incurred. If it's because of their cancellation, no. If it's because of your cancellation, yes. Okay, unless you have a TOPA, by the way, then and if you, most people also don't understand on the TOPA, and we'll get to that in a second, but TOPA is required for any adult living in the property who is not on title. So if you have a husband and wife and only the husband is on title, the wife has to have a TOPA. A lot of people get kind of annoyed at that, but the truth is that anybody who lives in that property who is not on title is considered a tenant. And so you have to have clarification of what those requirements are for that tenant. If you have seller rent back, which we technically, some of them aren't rent, but we still call it a rent back. The close of escrow date and 29 or fewer days is an SIP. And then if you're going to be 30 days or more, that's actually considered a tenant in the state of California. And that would be a residential lease after sale. And that creates a landlord-tenant agreement. And that requires a little bit more robust clarification. And so the RLAS would be in place in that case. If, again, you have anybody in that property that is not on title, they need a TOPA. If you have a buyer, a seller who is going to stay in the property after close of escrow, you also have to have a TOPA. So the seller remaining in the property after close of escrow, you want to make sure that their insurance is covered for them in that timeline. you want to make sure that, especially if they're going to do an RLAS, that your clients, you recommend to them that they speak to a qualified real estate attorney. Again, you're creating a landlord-tenant situation, which we know in the state of California can be fun. 9 times out of 10, they're not going to talk to an attorney, but having suggested that they do so in writing will help protect you in the event of an issue. And again, I would tell them, you are not a licensed real estate attorney. You can't give them legal advice. However, this form indicates that there are some regulations in place that they should probably be aware of, and that you suggest that they speak to a real estate attorney to get clarification. 99% of the time, there isn't a problem. So it doesn't need to be a big crazy thing, but you do want to clarify for your sellers that, and for your buyers, that this does create a landlord-tenant situation. So close of escrow is considered day 0 for, again, something that people get wrong all the time. Close of escrow is 0 for the purposes of counting the days the seller is allowed to remain in possession. So you close escrow on the 1st, that's day 0. The 2nd is day 1. So when you have 29 days, for example, close of escrow is 0, the next day is day 1, and after that you start counting, right? So you want to make sure that you have those timelines the same. Also, when you get into an escrow, check with your escrow officer to make sure your timelines add up. I've seen everybody get really close, to the end of an escrow, and then have their timelines not mesh with what escrow thinks their timelines are. So always just double check. If you have a tenant in a unit, you want to make sure that you have the TOPA attached as well. So the other thing that's interesting and different about this form, by the way, when you get into a transaction with a tenant, and we've seen a lot of this recently, whether the tenants are going to remain in possession or not. The tenants are considered to, if you've got a rental unit, the tenants will remain in possession. If they are not, and you check this box, the property is to be delivered vacant, then that needs to be before you have to clarify what timeline that is and when it will be presented vacant. The standard is 5 days before close of escrow. And you want to make sure that you have agreeable tenants. And again, that's something that you want to make sure that your seller has spoken to a landlord-tenant attorney, or a lot of times they'll just say, oh no, that's Bob, he's been there forever and he's a great guy, he's not going to be any problem. Just make sure you get that in writing, that you've identified that there could be an issue, and you want them to make sure that they are clarified that if there is, how they deal with it. This is kind of interesting. So the only thing that you are required to do as a seller, you don't, as I mentioned, have to actually do any repairs if the buyer asks for them, except you are legally required to install smoke detectors, smoke alarms, and carbon monoxide detectors and water heater bracing. So if the seller, unless the seller is exempt, if the seller is to pay for these items and does not fulfill his obligation, and the buyer incurs costs to comply. So we've gotten that question asked a lot. What happens if he doesn't do it, and then the buyer has to do it? The seller is responsible for the buyer's cost. A lot of times it's not a huge amount, but it is something that they are required by law. So that's something you want to be clarified with your agent on the other side to make sure that that's been done. A lot of times agents will just step in and have it done before close of escrow. However, if they aren't, the buyer does have the right to go after the seller if they don't do it. That is the one thing that they're required by law to do. Page 3 goes into we're going to start here at the top. What's included? I love this one. This one just amazes me. And when this first came out, I was just sort of laughing at this one, the bathroom mirrors. It's the only one that's pre-checked, right? We actually had that issue come up. I mean, right about at the same time. A seller moved out. He had these really pretty mirrors that his wife had purchased that went in all the bathrooms, and they pulled them out. And there was like 7 bathrooms in this house, and they had all these mirrors that were missing. So apparently that's a thing. The bathroom mirrors are included unless excluded below. The other thing that had changed on this, again, this is 2 years, but wall mounted brackets for video and audio equipment. Those used to be automatic that they were going to stay. They are now not automatic to stay. That is one that, and the reasoning behind it is because the technology has changed so much that the brackets are now basically sort of useless, because the equipment has changed so that it becomes non-helpful. So that's something, again, that you do want to, as an agent, take into account and say, look, this house has, 14 TVs that are attached to the wall. If those brackets don't match the TVs that you're bringing, or we're not asking for the TVs, do you want those brackets? If not, they will be taken off and the holes patched, but the walls not painted. And I've had that question asked a lot, actually. Why aren't the walls painted? And that's so you can see where the patches are. It kind of makes sense to me. The other thing is the refrigerators. That's always been a problem. They added wine refrigerators because you have an outdoor refrigerator in the, the cook area, and or a wine refrigerator. Those now can be asked for. So again, as an agent, you want to make sure that you go through that property, and if it's important to your buyer, you mark it on here. If it's not written in, write it in. There's a special refrigerator in the upstairs yoga room. You want to make sure you ask for it. The other thing that people miss a lot, if something is in the MLS, it is not automatically included. It has to be written into the contract. I don't care if it says it in the MLS 17 times and it's on every flyer. In order to alleviate problems and misunderstandings, you have to write it into the contract. If you want that chandelier in the entryway and it says it's included in the MLS, write it into here. Even still, you want to make sure that you have everything in there that's important to your client is written into the contract. Don't assume because it was written in the contract or the MLS and the flyer that it's included. It's not, unless it's written in here. The other one that's a biggie is the electric car charging systems and stations. So that one is one that is a newer issue, but it's certainly been a problem because they can be spending. The other thing is the smart home control devices. So you have smart, and that includes light bulbs, by the way. So if you have a smart home system, a lot of times that's controlled by your telephone. You don't get that person's telephone or their computer or their iPad. You do get the devices, and you'll have to create your own connection to those. So just be aware of that when you're talking to your clients. Again, anything that's attached to the property is going to stay. The other one that's always been a concern is curtains, by the way, and that's anything attached to the wall. And we actually had to add in the description on the curtains, brackets, anything that's attached to the window is essentially included. This again clarifies who is paying for which part of this report. So this one says what the report is, and this one says who pays. So if you put in here, for example, termite, and you don't say who pays for it, then that just becomes another issue that you're going to have to, it's ambiguous, and you'll have to clarify at some later date. If you put both, that's a 50-50. The government point of sale requirements and inspections and reports, that refers to, actually, I think we talk about that later, but that refers to the fire hardening, and it refers to some other reports that we'll talk about in a minute. Escrow fees, each to pay their own fees. This clarifies, if you put both, just so you are aware, again, this is a common mistake that agents make when they put both. That means that it's essentially 50-50. And if the buyer has lender fees, then you don't want the seller to pay the lender fees. So you want to always check each to pay their own fees, unless you want it to be 50-50. HOA fees. So the seller automatically pays the fees for preparing. So you'll notice there isn't a place here to change. This automatically has the seller paying for the preparing of the disclosures, and the certification fee is automatically paid for by the buyer. So that is not something that you can change. Where do you put TC fees? Well, that's actually a question that is, that's a good question. You can put them in as an additional fees, and I'll show you in a minute. Those are not, that's a discussion essentially that we're having as to whether or not that should be considered part of the transaction and passed on to the buyer and seller, or whether that should be an agent fee. But if you want to put in here, you can put fees or costs. You can put TC fee, and you can have buyer or seller or both pay for those. So you can put that here in these blank ones. But that's, just so you know, a question that's been kind of knocking around for a bit as to whether or not that should be paid for by the seller or not. Can you address seller and buyer move in and move out fees in Q14? I had to counter this for one seller who clarified he's only paying move out fees if it's applicable. I'm not sure what you mean by move in, move out fees. So a lot of that is specific to condominiums. If there's a fee that the condominium charges, this Q14 is oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So yeah, HOA move out. So it is condominium. HOA move out fee and buyer shall pay for separate move in fee. Applies if separately billed or itemized with cost in transfer fee. So when you have an HOA agreement that requires, for example, there are some in Santa Fe Hills that require an association. I forget what they call it. There's a fee for I don't know, that it pays for like fireworks and stuff like that. So sometimes there's an additional fee that's charged. This will charge for keys, it'll charge for openers, it'll charge for approval by the association, those kinds of fees. That is homeowner transfer fees. So the seller is going to pay for turning in that kind of stuff, and the buyer has to pay for his approval for his own. So yeah, that's I would put in there both. So unless otherwise agreed, the seller should pay for. So if you put nothing in here, then it's already clarified that the seller pays for move out and the buyer pays for move in, unless you clarify differently. So if I would just put both, and if you have something specific in any specific property, so there are some that have that fee, like I mentioned, that like for fireworks and stuff like that, I would clarify that the buyer would pay that. Sometimes the buyer's gonna try to negotiate that the seller pay it. So I think I would clarify, if it's important again to your seller or your buyer, that you identify what those amounts are. And that can go in 16 or 17 as well. So any additional, or that even might be considered a private transfer fee. So that might go under 15. Again, whatever it is, you want to clarify specifically what that amount is, and make sure that it's identified so that it's clear that who's paying for it and what that includes. Under the home warranty plan, a lot of agents are going to try and fit in here exactly what's covered in that home warranty. So, roof and pool and, all of the different things, depending on how much they want to have covered and what's included in that agreement. This can get a little little interesting, and then it'll go to a text overflow addendum. What I like to put in here, and I think is a little bit easier clarification, is attach. You can go to the whatever home warranty company you want to utilize, and get a bid. So put in there what you want to have covered, and they'll give you a bid and say per attached bid. And then you have a cost not to exceed over here. So if you put in, $750, and that coverage that your buyer wants costs $785, the buyer is going to be responsible for that additional $35 that's not covered under there. So you want to make sure that you are clear on what this amount is. Don't guess. I've seen agents be several $100s wrong on this number by guessing. For example, if you have a guest house on a property, that is a separate coverage plan. So that's going to be a whole other plan. So you want to make sure that you understand what your buyer is buying, what's important to them, and what's covered under that. So the best way to do that is to just get a bid from the home warranty company, so you know exactly what that number is. Also, if there is ever an issue with that coverage, and you go back to this contract, and that's what they will do. They'll go back to this contract and say, here it says that it only covered the pool and the roof. You may have added something later, but contractually it only writes that two things. It may or may not be covered. I've seen that come back. So if you have a bid from that company and that information is all included in that bid, it's much more difficult for them to argue it later. Again, it's just another layer of control for your buyer that I think that they will appreciate, having that additional protection. Page 4, we go into different states. So one of the things I actually, and we don't have a ton of time to go through the rest of these additional pages. Instead of having different forms, for example, for probate, we simply have addendums. So we have an addendum for probate. We have an addendum for manufactured homes. We have an addendum for any other form of a purchase, and it still keeps the RPA the same with the addendum to clarify the specific type of purchase. Tenancy in common, by the way, is actually becoming more uncommon now. So there's an entire form which clarifies. So there's a lot more of this, for example, with condos. So we're seeing people that are buying things as tenancy in common, and this clarifies who owns what. So they're owning a percent in undivided interest in the property, and it clarifies what they're actually buying. It only becomes a problem if they're doing it that way, but again, we have a separate form for these. Financial disclosures, all of these forms are separate forms that are in addition to the RPA, and this clarifies the purchase agreement and then the additional methods by which they're purchasing that property. Okay. So let me go back to, anybody have any questions about essentially the grid? When we get into the meat of the contract itself, it really comes down to those 3 pages, and then clarifying each one of these paragraphs with each one of these sections of the grid. The grid is the only thing that changes, other than the signature area as well. Okay, let me go to this Q&A. Oh yeah, I already answered that. BRE is changing. That, by the way, I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do, but one of the options for the BRE, for the buyer representation, BRBC, is that also may have a grid on it. One of the concerns with that buyer representation agreement was that it was confusing, whether you were showing one property, 6 properties, if you had a listing, or excuse me, an agreement for a month, a week, 6 months, that would clarify those as well. I'm not sure we're going to end up with a grid, but it's definitely going to be something that will be a little bit easier, hopefully, to understand. So one of the things that I wanted to go back to, since we're on that as well, and let me go back up to this page. Sorry, I know this is really, it makes you dizzy when I do it quickly. Is 3G3. Where is it? There we go. Okay, so they shrink it out. Okay, so the this is funny. I didn't pull the whole page up. Okay, so 3G3 refers to when you have a buyer representation agreement, and where I can download a sample RPA to share with clients. If you go to CAR and go to the education section, and there's a section, entire section on forms, and you can pull up the changes. You can pull up a blank form. It'll say sample on it. But if you're doing a form for a client, you can send them, you can to 123 any street, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and send that to them. If you're talking about in terms of the sending it to your client to have that conversation with them, you can fill out a form for them and use that as you're moving forward to write offers for them. For example, I would send them one first, so Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and just do 123 any street since you don't have an address yet, and utilize that. When will the new buyer agreement be released? Also, when is the new RPA available in zip forms? The RPA is available in zip form now. The new buyer agreement, I believe, is set for June. It may be sooner, depending on what happens with the lawsuits, and if we're mandated to do anything sooner, or if we do anything from a state level, we may have this move up timeline wise. I just think at the moment, for all of us to get used to utilizing that, get used to using it, talking to our buyers, get used to that agreement with them. You can literally do an agreement for one property on one day. So if you have a buyer who is hesitant, that doesn't want to sign something, sign their life away and only work with one agent for the rest of time, you literally can show them properties for a weekend. You can have that agreement be address specific, weekend specific, week specific, however you want to write it. Again, to the level of comfort of that buyer. You can have them work with you. For example, you're going to show them 5 properties tomorrow. You can put those 5 properties in that agreement and have them just be available, or excuse me, just be responsible for those 5 properties until and unless you have an agreement with them to purchase something, or they decide they love you or hate you or whatever it is. The other thing that's kind of a good thing about that agreement, by the way, is that it does delineate what you are going to be accomplishing for those buyers. Q5, Q6, who's responsible for paying for those reports is negotiable. That's why it says one or the other. You can ask for them as a buyer. Seller can come back and say that they want you to pay for them. Those are always negotiable. That's why they have either buyer or seller. Generally speaking, on the automatic reports that are required by the state, we're always going to ask for the seller to pay for those. But again, it's still negotiable. Yes, the zip forms, the most recent RPA is 1220, exactly 2 years ago. It's still 2 years ago. The amendments that may be made to that will be basically wordsmithing, not a substantive change to that agreement. That is going to stay. The RPA is going to stay the same. The things that will change are the 67 additional forms that can be attached to this RPA. That's what will change. So all the amendments, all the addendums, that's what will be changing. Q6. Government required point of sale correction of remedial actions. So those will be those are it depends. So government required point of sale requirements, there are very few of them in the state of California. In Northern California, I believe there's a couple of them. There are some, for example, that are water related. So whether you have restrictive water, which has been in since I believe 77 or something like that. So all of the water faucets in your house have to be low flow, toilets have to be low flow, that kind of thing. But they're not point of sale, they're just requirements. So there's very, very few in the state of California point of sale requirements. You can again negotiate those. And that's something that you would, when you're looking at a specific area, if you're unaware of any point of sale requirements, you can check with escrow. You can check with your title. Escrow is probably going to have the most comprehensive information as to what is required in that community. If you're working in an area they don't normally work in, that's somebody that I would request information of first. And again, still negotiable. If it's a point of sale requirement, there are some that are required, but that's going to be water heater, smoke detector, and carbon monoxide. Okay, we are out of time. Hour and a half goes by so quick, you guys. I try to talk fast, but honestly, it's just crazy how much there is. I tried to hit the things that most agents miss and try to get as much information as possible to you guys that will help you to fill out this form. We are always available to talk with you. If you get into, issue, obviously you're going to call your broker and have them walk you through it. But also here at the board, we do a lot of fixing of easily answered questions. We're happy to walk through that with you. Say that 6 times fast. Okay, you guys, this has been awesome. We are out of time, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we will get you hopefully a comprehensive list of forms to send out that you can utilize, and we will get the recording as well.